you don't need much of an introduction, but you are the head of clinical policy and strategy at Google's Verily and for Google Health. And you were previously the US Food and Drugs Commissioner. And before that at Duke, for instance, heading the Duke Translational Medicine Institute. And I'm going to post your bios separately here in the chat. But I think maybe to give you a little bit of context here. So this group of scientists, investors, and entrepreneurs in the aging space has met kind of more informally, but yet pretty regularly now for, I think, for over 20 times on a weekly basis. And we are currently kind of playing around and considering what we want to do next year. And so one idea that came up was potentially making this group into more of a kind of outcome-driven accelerator, or like an outcome-driven container in which we'll be collaborating on projects together. Basically what that would involve is that at the beginning of the year, maybe we would have a few folks come in from industry, academia, and in institutional settings to kind of discuss what are the biggest bottlenecks right now in the aging ecosystem. And then afterwards, we would, as a group, kind of define potential metrics for progress, including a few kind of like recent biomarker kind of projects that we already had, and potentially a few in the near future. So what would it actually mean to measure progress on the kind of like major goals in the aging ecosystem? And then lastly, and maybe at the end of next year, we would have some kind of like project development phase in which people in this group could actually collaborate on getting a few proposals going that would significantly accelerate the field. So this is a long-winded way of saying I'm terribly happy to have you here because luckily you were in academia, in industry, and in more institutional settings. So I would love to perhaps ask you a little bit the questions that we would basically be tackling at the beginning of next year, which are, what are the biggest bottleneck in the aging ecosystem, in institutional settings, and so on right now. So I think as a kind of like introductory question, maybe starting with Verily, what kind of projects has Verily recently been engaged in that you're most excited about, and how has this changed in the context of 2020 and COVID-19?
Well, that's a big question. It had multiple parts to it. So, I'd start by saying, at least my personal view is, up until the last 5 years, my thinking about aging was mostly in the context of we're doing great, things are going better and better with health in general. We have, an issue evolving with people living a long time and maybe not having great quality of life near the end of life. But lifespan is increasing just as something you would take for granted because technology and medical care and all are getting so much better. But now, we're now in year 6 of a decline in life expectancy in the United States, and a similar trend occurring led by the UK, but also Europe also following more in general, more of a sort of flattening pattern than declining in most of Europe. And so we're actually in reverse right now. And I think 2020, because of the selection of older people as the high-risk group for dying, we're going to see an acceleration of that trend. And so while I think all the previous sort of exciting issues about what we can do to make things even better, they still hold, but we'd better take a serious look right now and face the music that we're actually in a society which is in reverse in terms of life expectancy. And I think that it's something that we need to really turn attention to in a hurry. And if you look at the underlying factors of what's going on, it's COVID has just magnified the issues that already existed. Enormous disparity. So if you live in San Diego or San Francisco or Boston or basically any university town in the United States, it looks like Scandinavia. I think life expectancy is continuing to increase. Other health measures also look better. If you live in rural America, it's a rapid decline. And just a factoid there that I've gotten very interested in. Simple analysis. If you take the 2016 or the 2018 election and you look at the voting status of by county, Democrat or Republican, and look at the change of life expectancy from 1980 to 2014, which is the latest detailed data we have that's publicly available. There is a very direct correlation of voting status with change in life expectancy, so that for every year of loss of life expectancy relative to those counties that have the greatest gain, there's a 7.5% higher proportion of people voting Republican. And so when I think about aging right now, I think we have a house on fire, which is very different than the wonderful questions of what can we do with great biotechnology to improve a life expectancy that's already increasing. But if we then, look forward, assuming we solve some of these difficult, frankly, cultural problems that are causing this onslaught of common chronic disease, it's obvious that biology is continuing to move very rapidly. And if you combine all the medical technologies, what I'd say about Google Health and Verily, both, is that it's really the effort is more of a combined all-in, all aspects of life effort. So if you're on the Google Health side, mission number one is organizing the world's information and making it available. It's obvious that we no longer have much of a cultural divide in access to the internet via cell phones, because everyone has a cell phone, including a very high proportion of the elderly. But we have an enormous and growing divide in terms of ability of people to take advantage of that access in the sophisticated ways that lead to better health outcomes and better quality of life. This is something that is going to be an important issue, I think, for the new administration, and also something that we're very interested in working on the Google side. There's also, making sure people are connected to their healthcare system and clinicians. Apple has a really effort in this regard, but as you all know, iOS is 20% of the world, Android is 80%. So there's a growing effort to have the Android equivalent that would be to the rest of the world, frankly, the vast majority of aging people who need help being connected. And then you've got, I'm just sort of going from left to right as I think about translation. Obviously, we've got Calico in play and the deep biology part. And I think as people know, at least my interpretation of what's happened with Calico, not really involved at all, other than it's part of the alphabet family. I was a little more involved when Hal Barron was there because we're good friends, but he's now head of R&D at GSK. But my interpretation of part of what's happened with Calico in studying aging, they discovered all sorts of pathways that lead to druggable targets that may not have anything to do with what we typically think about aging, but have a lot to do with trajectory of pathways in cells. And it's going to be very interesting to watch. But we also have an array of devices that can connect to the Internet of Things, that can create environments at home for an aging population that, we hope will enable people to live at home for longer and not be institutionalized, and also be connected with their families. Needless to say, the COVID, the pandemic has accelerated all those trends, and made it so that it's likely to be easier to deploy these kinds of technologies in the future, because a lot of what was holding it back was regulation, particularly by the medical establishment, to not give away the turf of digitization, and keep it controlled by the traditional medical establishment. But I think we'll never go back to the way it was
No.
at this point.
No, I think that, I think there was a time at the beginning, when I think people were kind of like in disbelief and were still hoping that, you could just sit it out. And I think now it's becoming increasingly clear to that point. I have a list and a range of questions, and I'm already seeing a lot of them, a lot of questions popping up here in the chat. Would you mind if we take a few from the chat already?
That's fine, yeah.
Okay, great. Creon, maybe you go first, and then Tom, you go second. And everyone else, this is an invitation for you to collect some more in the chat.
Oh, great. Thanks, Allison. Appreciate it. And thank you for giving us this excellent talk, at least excellent so far. So obviously it's not the People's Republican votes that are directly shortening their lives, although it may be indirectly somewhat attributable to that correlation. What I want to know is, and this is related to what Tom posted in the chat, what do you think it is? And here's what I guess I'm asking. Is it that they're committing suicide because they're depressed and in despair, and that's what's shortening the life expectancy of these people? Is it that they're unhealthy because of, fill in the blank, terrible diet, lots of diabetes and metabolic syndrome in these red states for shortness? Is that what's causing their life expectancy to be decreased? Is it that their medical care is poor compared to, say, California? I know that that's an overlapping. Is it that like people in California stay away from the doctors and don't get sick, and hence also don't get killed by arguably a terrible medical system? If you look at that book Tom posted, what is it that's shortening people's lifetime? Is it all of these things, especially in this sort of red state, blue state comparison?
Yeah, I mean, a couple quick points there. If you adjust for readily available demographic, wealth, education factors at the county level, the relationship completely goes away. So there's no question. I mean, obviously, it's not what you check off at the ballot box that's in play here. It's the underlying factors. And, I think what makes it really hard is that I'm afraid it is all of the above. So, suicide rates in rural areas are much higher than urban areas now. Economic opportunities are lower. There's a joke in rural North Carolina, where I've spent most of my life, that the only expanding industries in rural North Carolina are nursing homes, funeral homes, and prisons. Other than that, there's really nothing going on that would give you hope for a future. And then it's made even more severe by the fact that most of the people who are at the top of their classes in high school in rural counties move to urban areas because they want to be with people who are thinking like they are. So I think this is a huge problem. And then the second point I want to make is it's not really a state issue, only insofar as states are aggregations of counties. But if you look at any of the red states and just draw a circle around the university towns, they look exactly like San Francisco or San Diego. So it's really more of a rural-urban divide that's occurring, and deeply cultural. What's causing the deaths? It's cardiometabolic disease, suicide, and addiction. drug overdose. Those are the big things that are changing. So
yeah, it's pretty interesting, by the way, if I may say, just to cut in and then I'll be quiet. It's like, and people on this team know I rave about this all the time. This is not something that's going to be solved with biomarkers and sequencing and exotic drug and interventions at the high-tech level. This is a totally different thing you're talking about. And oh, by the way, it's not going to push maximum human lifespan by solving these problems. It's kind of a separate thing than what we normally think of as, quote, longevity, unquote, in the tech community.
Right, couldn't agree more. And we're going to have to come to grips with it, or we're, if we're just speaking from the U.S. context, we're going to be in big trouble. And it's the social determinants of health. It's what do we do about it, the economies and the education and the opportunities. I do think there's a big role for digital technology. I do want to mention there is a big healthcare part of this, because if you just calculate the time it takes for a person with type 2 diabetes to get to a clinic with an endocrinologist, in many cases it's 2 to 3 hours. And it's obviously not a reasonable way to take care of chronic health problems, especially for the elderly, to ask that they get in a car and drive 2 hours to sitting in a waiting room to see a specialist for 15 minutes who's typing into a computer. So you can think of an entire array of digital backbone that could make an enormous difference for these people to just live where they are and have healthcare come to them rather than vice versa. I also think this is key to the economic problem, because we don't need all the employees that we used to need for farming. I can't personally say I've done this, but I'm told the big farms now run through geospatially mapped tractors that are highly mechanized and reducing the need for people. What we need are an army of community health workers to go to people's homes and help them with their basic subsistence and health and healthcare.
Okay, I've got to say one
thank
more
you.
in response to that, which is
make it quick, please. We have another question.
I understand what you're saying. To some extent, I agree. One might argue that the big farms growing the corn to make the corn syrup and the soy to make the fake meat is kind of and the stuff to make the bread is what's poisoning people and giving them diabetes to begin with. And if we fixed all that crap, they wouldn't need to see these specialists and get poisoned by ever increasing doses of insulin. It's very complicated and tied together.
No argument with that.
Right, great. Tom, your question, please.
Hey, Rob, great to see you again. I think there's no question that you're right, that if we look at the declines in life expectancy, we have to look at the underlying factors that are driving these deaths of despair that Angus Deaton and his wife have been documenting for a while. I think the comparative advantage on the people who are on this Zoom call is on trying to figure out how to create a sound regulatory environment for therapies that make a direct attack on some of the underlying causes of aging and could result in an increase in health span. So I'm wondering if you could comment on what you think might be some good models. And I'll just throw out a couple of examples. So one is the FNIH Biomarkers Consortium that FDA and the Foundation for the NIH and Industry and Academia put in with respect to both discovering and then validating biomarkers, number one. Number two, Near's work on the TAME trial and identifying some hard clinical endpoints that are composite endpoints. Number three, the work that the FDA has done to create centers of excellence in regulatory science, including one right here in UCSF and Stanford. And number four, Congress encouraging the FDA to provide guidance on issues like regenerative medicine, where you have an emerging technology and industry and academia is looking for some guidance from the FDA about how they're going to treat these. I'm wondering what models you think are worth exploring if the geroscience hypothesis is correct, which is that that we know enough about the biology of aging to identify interventions like addressing senescent cells, for example, and how the FDA, industry, and academia could work together to create regulatory pathways that go beyond just a single indication.
Yeah, so let me start with just this statement that we need to, I mean, the first thing is to tend to the knitting of the basic stuff we just talked about. And it does have a regulatory component because we decided years ago, decades ago, that we had a deficit in cancer drugs and drugs for rare genetic diseases or rare diseases in general. We put incentives in place and put a massive investment into the NIH, and it's really paying off big time now. After decades of people arguing that it wasn't going to pay off, it obviously is doing so. But we have a real shortage of investment in chronic disease therapeutics now relative to the magnitude of the problem. And you can't solve an incentive problem by just saying everything has to be incentivized, because then nothing is. So I think we have a big policy question right now about what to do to create a system that has greater throughput for the common chronic problems that we're all dealing with. And then, the new areas of biology and technology related to things like senescent cells. I mean, we got to face it. If your blood pressure systolic is 220 and your LDL cholesterol is 150, you're going to age faster. We know that. But we know how, we have a lot to do for that. We could do more. But then when we get into the new areas, I think the programs that you mentioned, I've been involved in all of them, and I'm a proponent. And I would argue at least that we need to be more purposeful and put larger investment into it. Despite the recent growth of the NIH budget, for example, I think it's still pretty small relative to the magnitude of the health problems that our country faces as a part of, our overall situation relative to other sectors. I also really, really strongly believe, I learned a lot in my job at FDA, and I felt like the relationship that we had towards the end there between FDA, NIH, and CDC and CMS was beginning to create a framework that could really accelerate discovery into translation. And I hope that in a new administration that will get back on track, because I believe if you look at it from the CMS perspective, you'd have to say that an investment in technology to reduce chronic disease burden would have a huge impact on cost at CMS. And if the evidence generation system that was part of that was of much higher caliber, you'd also stop paying for things that don't work, which is a pretty high proportion of things that we currently pay for. So, and I think, CERSI is an interesting example of somewhat directed, but I think it could be more so towards the targets that are really critical to society right now.
Thank you. I think in terms of, I guess, Tom, did you want to follow up on anything?
Oh, I just wanted to say a little bit about regulatory science,
okay,
which is
but,
that they,
you mentioned already.
Yeah, so the FDA has to make a lot of decisions. They would like them to be science-based, but in many cases, that science doesn't exist. So the regulatory science is an effort to partner with places like UCSF and the Mayo and Stanford and Yale to create that evidence, particularly in some of these emerging areas.
All right, great. Well, I think, you already mentioned, increased funding for the NIH. I think one aspect that we also discussed here a few times is, still the kind of like siloing of NIH, but also really like the NIA. And, I think someone here really on this call suggested that, one reason may be that, or one reason that so much funding is still going, for example, just for Alzheimer's, maybe because there's a bunch of people that can lobby for that and can make a case for that, whereas there aren't very many people that are complaining about the fact that they're aging. So I'm wondering whether you see any kind of like pathways in which more funding could be directed within the NIA specifically in targeting aging as a root cause of underlying diseases, or do you see any like potential promising pathways in which to target that more specifically?
Oh boy, I mean, I may not be the right person to try to answer that question. I was on the council of NIA for a few years, and it was mostly to help them try to grapple with the problems they were having with clinical trials. And, I learned a lot there. I could be completely wrong about this, but when I look back at cancer, Nixon declared war on cancer. NCI got double the investment, and then it doubled multiple times after that. So it's the biggest investment that we make at the NIH. And it wasn't specific. The amount of money enabled a lot of things to be tried, most of which didn't work in terms of practical translation into things like therapies. But over time, we learned a lot more about what cancer really is and how to combat it. And now we're in this very different era of cancer therapeutics. So you have to wonder whether the best approach to NIH is just to increase overall funding and have, keep the discovery part of the NIH vital. The part of it I feel like an expert in is in clinical trials and translational implementation, where I think it's exactly the opposite. What we need is much more focus on efficient systems to evaluate things that we think might work, get rid of the things that don't work quickly, and really go from a very fragmented system where most of the clinical trials we start never reach a conclusion, and get to a system where the trials that really matter get enrolled quickly so that we get the answers. And then I think, you all have brought up a lot about biomarkers. I'm a huge advocate of biomarkers. Biomarkers really made my career in cardiology, because, for example, when we figured out that opening an artery is what really mattered for heart attacks, we had a thing we could measure in a small number of people that told us whether a therapy might be useful. And then, we could do the big clinical trials to sort out which ones really had a positive balance of benefit and risk, and then the comparisons among them. So I'm not a big fan in the basic science arena of being too specific about exactly where we put our funding, but I think the common chronic diseases are, what I would emphasize right now, and how aging separated from what the targets of common chronic disease, how that's separated. That's a really interesting question where I'm just not expert enough to say what should be done.
In terms of, I think, biomarkers, I would be also really curious to get your advice, because I think a few people in this group are collaborating in which different folks could share data that they generated and perhaps compare different biomarkers specifically for health span with each other and even for different interventions. And so I'd be really curious to kind of like hear your ideas on, which kinds of biomarkers, if you have any ideas, would you like to see evaluated, on which kinds of interventions, And do you think there are any that are particularly likely to be successful with the FDA?
Well, so step one is to make sure that we're clear on the definitions. And one of the revealing moments in my government career was we started a council between FDA and NIH that would meet once a quarter of the leadership. And at the very first meeting where I was commissioner, Harold Varmus made a really stupid statement about surrogate endpoints. He confused biomarker and surrogate. And Janet Woodcock stood up and gave him a lecture in front of the whole thing. It was really quite a scene. We realized as we talked about it that these very common terms, we didn't have agreement on what the definitions were. And so we ended up spending a year of meetings and came up with something called BEST, biomarkers, endpoints, surrogates, something like that. And it's a public document which is still being maintained to try to get this right. So if you ask me, am I excited about biomarkers? Yes. Am I excited about surrogates for aging? Boy, that's going to be a tough one, because things that are correlated with biological phenomena and clinical things there are going to be a lot of those, and they're going to be extraordinarily useful. It will give us clues as to what to pursue and what might work. But things that can substitute for benefit risk evaluation, particularly if you're separating aging from specific disease outcomes, that's a really hard one, because when we start using interventions that affect the entire set of systems that make up the human body, it's very unpredictable what risks may emerge over time, and also what benefits may accrue over time that we never expected. I'm still in awe of the SGLT2 drugs in diabetes, which had we not required that there be outcome studies, we probably would not know today that they reduce your risk of death and extend life considerably across the board, not only for people with diabetes, but for people with heart failure. And that these drugs were in no way thought to have any effect like that. It's just because we were doing big studies looking for safety that it emerged in every single study, and then we converted to it. So yes to biomarkers. Surrogates, we should all be pursuing surrogates, but my degree of confidence that we'll have really useful surrogates is pretty low in this field.
I think a lot of the point of inviting you, if I'm not mistaken, was to specifically just expand on this exact subject, with the point of saying, how can we better move from biomarkers to surrogates?
So here's where I think I would just say there's a need for a lot of methodology development and funding of the type that doesn't normally happen at the NIH. Because to actually validate something as a surrogate, you need proof with more than one intervention where you actually get the clinical outcomes and you have the biomarkers. And so how do you validate a biomarker for something that you want to predict 20 years later in that context? Well, you either make a guess, in which case we call it a putative surrogate, or you got to wait 20 years times 2 at least, and preferably times 5 or 6. So, and the risk of using putative surrogates for a problem where people are not symptomatic when you start, or not, there's not an immediate issue of improved quality of life or clinical outcomes, and you're hoping to prevent something 20 years later, the risk, if you let it out there on the market, that you could do a lot of harm is extraordinarily high. So, this is an area where we need I think, very focused methodologic work to try to come up with our best prediction methods to understand better what might work, maybe starting with, intermediate length studies like 5 to 10 years.
Rob, are there any good case studies where there was an intentional effort to go from biomarker to surrogate in a way that you think was rigorous and wound up improving decision making by the FDA?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say there's, unfortunately, the list is relatively short. But the examples are pretty clear, and the actual validation is more recent than most people would think. But I think within the lipid field, is really a good place to look, because if you say what dictates your risk of developing atherosclerosis, well, a low LDL cholesterol high LDL cholesterol predicts, and a low HDL cholesterol predicts. And so the industry went to work saying, well, these are great surrogates, and everyone agreed. And it turned out that there are a host of LDL lowering drugs that actually kill people, and there are even more HDL raising drugs that kill people. And yet they're still probably among the best surrogates that we have. And so I think that, the method that's been used to deal with that is, and diabetes is another. Hemoglobin A1C is a good surrogate in diabetes, but it doesn't necessarily tell you the benefit risk over time, because other pathways always get affected when we intervene. And so in both those cases, the standard has become, you can get on the market showing an impact on your surrogate with reasonable preliminary safety data, but then you got to do a post-market set of studies that nail it down. And I think those have been, that's why I brought up the SGLT2 one, because those drugs got on the market for improving hemoglobin A1C in studies of a few thousand people, but the outcome studies are multi-thousand people done in the post-market phase. I think, in cancer, the effect on tumor size has been a really interesting one, because that doesn't appear to work hardly at all, for example, with immunotherapy. And so, for everything that looks really great, I can give you examples where it's failed. So it's always, some judgment and a lot of empirical data that's needed. And then finally, I would point to accelerated pathways. And this is where I think the conundrum lies. I think we're all, for example, Alzheimer's disease, we're completely justified in being scared of Alzheimer's disease. I got out of our 4 parents that we have, only one is still alive. Good news is most, the others lived to a ripe old age. But, Lydia's mom at age 92 is in an extended care facility with dementia, and we should all be scared of that. But treating someone for 30 years to prevent something that's going to happen that far in the future based on biomarkers, as I've said, is really frightening to me. On the other hand, if you have the accelerated pathways at FDA were developed for diseases that had no treatments, that were uniformly led to bad outcomes in a short period of time. And there's a case where we give the FDA tremendous leeway. And it's sort of like what we're all talking about now with the EUAs for vaccines and therapeutics for COVID. The law for an EUA says potential benefits weighed against potential risks, as opposed to benefits weighed against risks. And so to cut to the chase, and after this long-winded description, what I'd love to see is sort of for these areas of tremendous societal importance where we don't really know what to do, create something that's in between typical NIH research and typical FDA regulation that would be like a safe harbor to develop new approaches to something that's in between having to wait 20 years to get on the market with a potential therapeutic and the enormous risk of just using biomarkers the way we currently think of them. And I think that's going to take a lot of iteration and testing out. But I would hope to see that happen.
Are you talking about a specific like organizational structure there, or?
Yeah, one example that's not quite the same, but may have some of the same structural characteristics would be what's been done with tobacco. The user fees on tobacco have created a huge fund that goes to the FDA. Half of it is for research, but I think the FDA made a wise decision to give half of that money directly to the NIH in a fund that's run out of the NIH director's office that runs like an NIH peer-reviewed grant application process, but tuned specifically to the priorities of the FDA in the regulation and public health interest of tobacco. So it's one of these in-between things. Frankly, in the 21st Century Cures Act, we tried to create something similar for regenerative medicine because we had to, sort of like tobacco, we have all these crazy people that are doing dangerous stuff almost completely unregulated on the one hand, and then we have this great science on the other hand and a great public health need. And I think we got part of the way there, but the idea was to create centers of excellence that would translate under sort of supervision and ensure that the evidence was developed about what was effective and what was not. In a situation where the industries, the typical pharmaceutical industry didn't want to invest because anything they did might be eroded by the fact that it sort of can be couched as practice of medicine and operated underneath the radar of regulation. Just to mention one other thing Tom brought up, because it's a red hot issue that I hope in the new administration will be dealt with. As opposed to many other industries, the regulated medical products industry typically wants more guidance. And so the very aggressive anti-regulatory stance of the current administration has made it almost impossible for the FDA to create guidance. It was hard enough when I was there. And the reason that it's so hard to do is that the political side of the executive branch wants to control what the FDA can say. But they're not thinking about the fact that if you're, for example, developing a regenerative medicine therapy, a good FDA guidance is like the total state of the art of where a field is, because the FDA gets to see what everybody is doing, but can't necessarily reveal the trade secrets, but they can abstract what's known into guidance that'll keep people from going down paths that are not productive, or can help people go down paths that are likely to be productive. And so I'm certainly going to be trying to influence the administration to radically increase the production of FDA guidance. Remembering that guidance, as Tom knows well, right at the front it says has no binding authority. It's not like rules or laws, which you must follow or you're punished. Guidance is the best advice at the current time.
All right. Well, I have two questions that pop up directly, and maybe you can decide which one you want to tackle, or maybe even both. But in terms of FDA, I would love to know if you think that there's any specific, let's say, low-hanging fruits that you think are aging relevant that could be potentially, like approved rather quickly, or what would be the most promising low-hanging fruits to tackle there, and what are kind of like lessons learned from trials that you see fail in the past? So that's, I think, one question on the FDA, and then another question that came up which was because someone who's actually here on the call created like a structure that isn't quite like the one that you just described, but like a proposal for like a focused research organization that would basically tackle kind of like things that would have big multiplier effects for the aging ecosystem that are almost like public goods that otherwise don't really get done. So maybe that could be better data generation or data analysis. And maybe that person, if they want to, can share a little bit more as well. That's an invitation in case you'd like to. But for that, my question would be, what kind of like big kind of ecosystem-wide bottlenecks do you think we could be tackling as a field, given that Verily had now two really amazing projects, one Terra, and that is really trying to do this a little bit more data-focused and driven approach, and virtual strainer. So one question is, FDA, what could be like, what are specifically promising low-hanging fruits that could be kind of like fast-tracked that are aging relevant? And then the other one would be, what kind of foundational bottlenecks would you like to see like a new organization tackle?
Yeah, actually, the way you've asked the questions has helped me on one thing that I'll mention. But I mean, let me just first say the very lowest hanging fruit, and it's painful to even have to say this, is that we don't know the right dose of any drug essentially for older populations, because they're not included in clinical trials in relevant numbers for a whole variety of historical reasons. And we are working on this now at the National Academy's Drug Forum with FDA and industry. And I think there should be something like what we have for the pediatric rule. For those of you who haven't been involved in this, there was a time very recently when there was a feeling that children needed to be protected from human experimentation. And so no one did clinical trials in children with drugs. And it led to a situation where the companies would say, well, we haven't studied it in children, good luck. And pediatricians had no option but to prescribe the drugs, even though no one knew what the right doses were. And so a set of laws were passed, and the term therapeutic orphan was developed as a buzzword. And a bunch of laws were passed that made it required that if you're going to develop a drug that could be used in children, that you do relevant clinical trials. And a part of the NIH, which I was a recipient of the grants at our research institute, was essentially ordered to put up a clinical trials network to do the studies, because there were so many drugs that had already extended through their whole patent life that were now generic, where no one knew the right dose. And they were some of the most frequently used drugs in children. So there was no company that would do the study. So the NIH has been doing them. There've been like 120 or so drugs for which the labels had to be rewritten because of these studies. I would argue that if you're, I'm 69 now, so I'm very sensitive to this. You start getting into your 70s and 80s, these docs are on their own out there. And when you have multiple organ systems involved, it's really complicated. So the lowest hanging fruit for me is to create some either incentives, carrots or sticks or both, that force the issue that the right studies get done in this population, which for many drugs is the largest population for which drugs are prescribed, the aging population. And then the second thing is that, I've already talked about it, but I mean, if you were going to create a vortex, between FDA, NIH, and CMS, the aging population is the obvious place. I mean, the other one that I would mention that I'm very interested in, which is on the other end of the spectrum, pregnant women. It's very similar to what I described about children. There's almost nothing known about drugs and pregnant women, because you'd be out of your mind to do those studies right now as an individual company. You can just write in the label, we didn't study it, contraindicated, even though knowing full well that the drugs are going to get prescribed, because if a woman has a disease when she's pregnant, it's going to have to be done. So that's another area that I see as similar. But you could really see the creation of of an organized effort to solve problems of aging that involves the key elements that would have to be included. And, you know, if you just look at a tiny part of the CMS budget, it could provide funding that would be unimaginable by NIH terms.
All right. Well, what would be the steps to be doing such a thing? And in the meantime, Michael, maybe you can get your question ready.
Well, the steps are, this is all about finding the right policy window, and we're about to have one that's going to be really big, and there's going to need to be a bunch of funding applied. You know, the question is, what's the angle for aging, given that, you know, the reason for the big amount of money that's going to need to be invested is the pandemic. And maybe there is an opening here because it really brought attention to the fact that essentially it's a killing field for older people right now in the United States. And, you know, when I look at the linear exponential curve of death from COVID related to age, it doesn't look much different than most other diseases. It's just magnified, and maybe that point could be taken to try to get people behind it. But you know, to have programs like this started, you need to find the right policy window. Maybe this is it.
Okay,
So,
great.
So cancer researcher, A-bomb inventor, and general scientific polymath Leo Szilard noted in the 1950s that in general, scientific research as allocated by the NIH and NSF tends to slow down scientific progress. More recently, Nobel laureate, DNA inventor, and cancer expert James Watson specifically called out the war on cancer as dramatically slowing the rate of innovative and potentially efficacious new cancer modalities being deployed over the last 40 years. More recently, Sarah Constantine, mathematician and aging researcher, wrote, I guess Szilard was also an aging researcher. More recently, Sarah Constantine wrote the same thing, actually wrote a book-length treatise on how the war of cancer slowed down research on cancer. I'm curious as to how we would go about correcting the damage that has historically been caused by the government trying to accelerate science with funding.
I just think you're quoting these people as, you know, they're just wrong. That's okay. People can be wrong.
You mentioned Harold Varmus. Varmus was obviously a prominent FDA guy. He recently spoke in the New York Times about how we have to ignore.
No, Varmus was never at FDA.
Okay, I'm sorry. Nonetheless, he recently spoke in the New York Times about how we should ignore the CDC. Given the nature of the current administration and controversies around it, how would we go about deciding which government agencies we should and should not ignore?
I mean, there are many specific parts of government funding of research that we could all criticize, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. It can always be made better, but at least it's my contention that the science infrastructure that was largely created by government funding that gave people places from which they could work, and the subsidy of private industry by that funding, you know, has enabled the U.S. to be far and away the technological leader of the world in this and every other field. So, yeah, there are a lot of errors along the way, and you could think of specific things, but I just don't buy, you know, James Watson, please give me a break. You know, he's shown some pretty bad judgment, I think, in some other areas. We live in an aberrant administration right now that is overtly anti-science. And so, yes, I mean, the problems right now, you can imagine being between YouTube and Google search, we reach approximately 4 billion people a day in the world, and we're the main conduit of information. Our strategy was typically would be to say, we need to rely on credible sources, mostly the CDC and the WHO in this area of pandemic and vaccine, but we can't do that. right now for the reasons that you gave. So there are complexities here. I'll just say that if the returns today hold up, I think what you're going to see is a tremendous, it's like the Berlin Wall just came down in the scientific agencies. I think there will be a renewal program for people that did leave out of protest to come back. And I think you'll see a tremendous resurgence of common messaging about things that work from the pandemic. But I don't want to make light of what you said. This is tricky. Government sources of information are not necessarily always credible. There's just no doubt about that.
Thank you. I think we had Jim with a specific question to the new org structure that you proposed, or to at least how advantageous. Jim, do you just want to ask it yourself, or should I go first?
Yeah, sure. I'll ask it. So, Dr. Califf, getting back to aging, the biggest pot of money related to aging, obviously, is CMS, and you mentioned it briefly earlier. I wanted to ask how adventurous you think CMS can get going forward in reimbursing for very new or somewhat data limited experimental treatments for aging, given that the savings for CMS itself would be immense if any of those pan out.
Yeah, three things to say about that. Number one, CMS can be as adventurous as the Congress and the White House allow it to be. If we want to change the CMS behavior, we've got to pay a lot of attention to who we elect and how we influence them. Point number two, we almost got there during my time in the Obama administration. There are situations where CMS can allow extra reimbursement for participation of clinicians in getting the clinical trials done, et cetera. But point three related to that is there's a process called coverage with evidence development that just got completely scuttled by the current administration, and it's not loved by the industry. But to me, it's the only solution, because you're looking at the upside. Could save a lot of money if the treatment works, but if the treatment kills a lot of people will lose their jobs for having allowed it to happen. There's a short memory on the uncertainty part of this. So the solution to it is to allow entry with the requirement that the clinical trials get done as part of the payment system to actually get the real answer. And it worked in coronary stents, maybe too well. Stents got overused, but there's no question, I was very involved in that pilot program, and I'd love to see it come back. And I think it should be part of this consortium effort among federal agencies that I talked about.
Lovely. If you have time for one more question, there was related, the organization that I mentioned is actually was proposed by someone here on this call, was Adam. Adam, if you want to maybe ask a question or say a few words about it.
Yeah, I mean, we're thinking, and I'm thinking with Tom about trying to galvanize both in philanthropic and government sectors, basically sort of focused medium scale projects. And I think there might be some just pure technical opportunities to try to make a big push on developing biomarkers. But another one that we're interested in is trying to really clarify this idea of hallmarks of aging by doing sort of multi-omics in animal models after many different interventions, and sort of making a matrix of interventions versus effects. So that's more of a comment, I guess. But I think if there are hurdles, ending, yeah.
Well, I lost the last part of what you were saying.
That was just a question about major technical hurdles as opposed to regulatory hurdles in terms of biomarker development or understanding aging hallmarks.
Yeah. A question had come up about Terra, just for those not involved with it. I mean, Terra is meant to be a comprehensive biomolecular and clinical data system that would allow disparate parts of the biomedical system to be aggregated and normalized across different data types, ultimately producing, this capability of using high-end computing to look at multidimensional biomarker development would be one particular application. And I'm very enthusiastic in the long run about a concept called phenotype stacks, which is a concept that if you go from subcellular component genes to subcellular components to cells to tissues, organs, and the whole system, there are different measurement systems that are used to measure things. And we can find commonalities now by using multidimensional computing to develop a whole array of different phenotypes than we had before. The example we use is hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where it really comes into play, and it hopefully will lead to mutable biomarkers that might allow earlier intervention and prevention. So, to me, the big technical issue is actually getting the systems built out to be able to combine the data and get it in a format where high-end computing can be used. But then I noticed in the chat box, a lot of people have asked questions about transparency. I think, I've spent a good part of my career working on transparency of clinical trials, and now it's the law that if you do a clinical trial, you have to register it. You have to register your results. You have to register your protocol and your analysis plan. We need something like that in preclinical data. And I just don't know what that looks like, because it's such a vast world. It's so heterogeneous. But ultimately, to build the complex systems that are going to be needed, we're going to need a lot of people working together in a different kind of science. Those things are easy to say, they're really hard to do. One other thing just to mention from the chat box, someone asked a taunting question: if you believe everything you say, why doesn't Verily and Google invest more in therapeutics as opposed to what you're doing? Well, I mean, we're a digital tech company delving into biomedical science, so we're focusing our direct work on that aspect of it and building systems that hopefully will accelerate therapeutics development. But we have no intention of being a drug company. I will add that we do invest a lot of Google money. It helps to make $11 billion a quarter in profit, which needs to be invested in things that are helpful. But we invest a lot in therapeutics companies, including many related to aging.
All right. Well, Robert, I'm sure that I see continuously more questions streaming, and I want to be very mindful of your time. I think, a few of us may stay on a little longer. You're very, very welcome to stay, but I'm cautious that we're already 5 minutes over your time. I think as you could also read from the chat, I think a few folks have really said that this was one of our best meetings thus far. Thank you so much from all of us for taking the time to meet with us. It was tremendously useful, I think. Thank you very, very much for being so spontaneous and jumping into it. I hope it was helpful. Take care. And I think there's a bunch more questions popping up, but it was very helpful. Yes, thank you so much for joining, and I'll be in touch with follow-ups. Thank you very, very much.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye. Okay. All right, as I see there's 28 more folks on the line. I think Robert may have to. Yes. Okay, great. Well, I'm glad we got five more minutes longer. Would anyone like to discuss anything? Ravi, I think you had a few questions, but I think they were specifically addressed to Robert, correct? Are there any comments, points? Would anyone like to follow up with anything or open something up for discussion here in the group?
Yeah,
Larry, I see you.
One area I'd like to follow up on, maybe I could get connected with Robert later, is given what he was saying about them being obviously a tech company and crossing into biotech, one question I have is, especially with the integration with YouTube and some systemic fundraisers and action awareness campaigns they do through YouTube and Google, what they could do very easily with a fraction of their money is create very slick and engaging data visualizations that would show, for example, in this case, what would be the socioeconomic benefits if we spent this much and achieved this to prevent future pandemics, this and that. That would be very engaging, make the value proposition very clear, and cause the things that he was talking about that preceded the war on cancer and opened up the funding. So Google could do that so easily, and it would cost a fraction of whatever budget they're spending on this. So I wanted to ask that, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks so much. Well, if anyone would like to jump in, then feel free.
Sort of a different direction, perhaps, which is just he mentioned this idea of an organization between FDA and NIH, and I mean I think his notion is something very large and bureaucratic. But the question is sort of what is the scope of what would be useful there? Is it something more like DARPA or HHMI, that's a funding/research organization that has a different model that could be more effective? And is that something that we want to think about?
Well, Larry, I think you're also unmuted yourself. I'm not sure if you had any.
Well, yeah, I mean, we worked with Rob at FDA, and it's one of the tragedies is that he didn't hang around for very long enough to really change things at the agency. Because again, a lot of it is organizing data. I mean, that's what I think we need to do, and that's what we get most of our data in FDA in PDFs. So you really can only analyze one application at a time. I mean, it's not much better than paper. And so what we're trying to do is to organize a lot of the data that we get in. A lot of the preclinical data is very valuable data. I mean, it can predict adverse events. It can predict whether elderly are going to have a problem or not, and that's what we're trying to organize. And we have started relatively small projects with NIH. I mean, I collaborate a lot with NCATS, which is the newest institute at NIH. And, we developed a system that we can distribute to drug companies so that hopefully they'll send data into a structured. A lot of it is then being able to release the data and things like that, which, we can't, before a clinical trial happens, I think everything should be on the table so that everybody can see it, but that's not the current policy. And Europe was going to go that way because they had some problems in phase 1 trials, but then they backed off a little bit. But I think it would benefit industry a tremendous amount because, like Robert said, I mean, most of the phase 1 trials don't end up in phase 3, you're hitting the same targets all the time, and, they may or may not be successful. So I think, more transparency in research, especially, in the pharmacological research and the clinical research is what's really needed. And we also need to have better ways to do less expensive clinical trials, because clinical trials are just way too expensive to do. And I think that's what we have to do, to have either a common control arms between trials. I mean, there's a lot of innovation happening at UCSF with some of the people over there. But those are things to really get things. But a lot of things we don't know. Like you said, most medicine doesn't work. And, and some does, and it works for some people, and how to figure out what works and what really doesn't work is what is really the problem. And, because we waste a lot of money, we do a lot of damage to people, with some of the medicines and some of the even practice of medicine. And that's how to get that better and things like that, to get the budgets down and things. Yeah.
So most medicine doesn't work, but also we basically have good scientific methodologies for using statistics and ideally Bayesian statistics to discover what medicine does and doesn't work.
Well,
so if medicine basically doesn't work, it seems like very straightforwardly that that's due to political consideration.
Statistics is
okay. Not all at once.
Yeah.
Larry, what would you like to say?
Well, that's what I say. I mean, so medicine is, we're trying to get more personalized medicine because, with cancer, I mean, it really depends on what therapeutic protocol you get. And like Robert said, we don't know the dose of any drug. What's the best dose, really, to be honest with you. And we don't know what's the best dose of aspirin, and that's the thing, is that how to get, what is, for COVID, I think there's therapies out there that work, but how can I get them tried? With simple therapies. And, some of the people here have mentioned them too, but, instead we're going with these really expensive stuff that, you can only give IV and, later on, and we misinterpreted a lot of stuff. The problem with COVID, the antivirals have shown very little efficacy with COVID.
We have good interventional studies showing vitamin D to be very, very effective.
Again, that could be an answer. But how do we get it out there? And, vitamin D, famotidine, there are some things on famotidine that look very promising. Even aspirin, look very promising. So those are the sort of things that we have to test. But again, there's no commercial incentive to test these things. And to really get good data. The real problem with nutritional data is that the data is all over the place, and nobody does really good nutritional studies or, these dietary supplement studies and that to make a conclusion. But yeah, the one from Spain looked very good. I think that Carol shared, that looked very good for vitamin D.
Right, critically, that was an interventional study, not a cohort study. So we really should be able to
better data. The real tragedy is our medical system, where medical records are all over the place in different systems, and you can't even put them together. And that's why countries, I think Kevin mentioned Estonia and things like that are organizing medical records so we can do these long longitudinal observational studies.
Yeah,
Carl, do you have?
I just wanted to jump in on that last point because I've been following up from the previous conversations on data standardization and digging into the different systems and the NIH and all of us and et cetera. And I basically so far what I've uncovered is, to that last point, there are some very basic things that are getting in the way of this sort of data cross collaboration that could easily be corrected with just some sort of notice. For example, a lot of the different systems are using different ways of creating a unique key for the users, some way to take private data, encrypt it, and hash it to some unique value. They're not doing it in any sort of standardizing way, so the systems can't talk to each other. And all that you would need to do is whatever the NIH says, we're creating this new health key system. These 3 bits of data, use this algorithm to make this key. If you want to play with us, everybody do that same thing. These really kind of basic errors in sort of data standardization are they could be corrected very easily.
That's a good point that should have been made before he left the call, because that's the kind of thing that, getting the big tech giants on board. And, for example, within house at Google, at Apple, they have that same problem, and they have solved it just by decree. They create a good library and everybody uses it. It's a little harder to use it across government agencies, but
So I'm working on I should be done soon in a couple of weeks, Carl, with sort of like a pitch deck for this sort of stuff. So if Allison, maybe if you could connect me with Robert, I could supply him that, because in my opinion, it's really easy to solve and it's a huge roadblock.
Yeah, there is a fair bit there. I'm actually pretty familiar with the Terra system that Allison described. That grew out of something at the Broad Institute and has then been adopted by all of us. So it's sort of generalizing to storing a wide variety of genomic and medical data in the cloud. And that sounds like that may be, one of the building blocks that can be used for that. Both sort of for the compute side and for being able to store and share data, because the goal is really being able to share all the data that comes in from the All of Us program. One of the driving things.
Another important thing here is obviously the Estonia model would be great, right? But I think it's very important that we identify intermediary steps there that we can maybe do right now. And then as they work, get more public buy-in for blockchain and all this kind of stuff. We need to come up with a very tactical roadmap of how we grow to that.
I tried to sign up on Terra, and you could basically submit something of either do you have data to provide or other bits. And I read on some blog that the data standardization there's also is I think something that's pretty challenging. I think that's also something that we discussed on the recent biomarker.
There are some places like Kaiser
discussion, right? How to do that best. But any other comments? Yes, Larry.
Yeah, there are some places like Kaiser and even the VA that have relatively standard data, across whole systems and across, fairly long lifespans. And, the VA has a lot of elderly patients and things like that. And they had a standardized system. They're changing their system. They even had an open system, and to get more access to de-identify data from there, I think would be really helpful. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, Carl?
I want to ask a biomarker FDA question. So is there some in between? So I can ask this from two different directions, but it gets at the same thing. So are there, in clinical trials, does the FDA mandate measurement of certain variables as just part of the way? Like, I don't know enough about the way FDA trials run, but like, are there ways that that trials are forced by top-down decree by the FDA to balance their control versus treatment groups, and or things that they're required to measure for later stratification, even if they aren't primary endpoints? I feel like maybe there's room for some kind of third category between a surrogate endpoint and a biomarker that's just used in research, where there's some kind of biomarker that has an official status at the FDA that's important for clinical trials. It's not good enough as a surrogate end marker for you to claim success and get on the market by moving it, but it's important enough that the FDA says on certain kinds of trials must measure it in both, in all patients, treatment and control, for later analysis stratified by that. So for example, are there FDA trials for other conditions that aren't necessarily longevity or aging trials where where you have to have the age of the participants, and that's part, and that has to be part of the data set for analysis? If that's true, then it might be an easier, there might be a case to be made that says, look, we have, if the reason that you have to measure age is because it affects risk or whatever, and we have this marker, we have this other thing, maybe it's a methylation age clock, and it's better at measuring that risk, then maybe that should be required to be measured. For example, so to bring this home to Michael bringing up vitamin D and COVID, right? It's now well known that vitamin D serum level, vitamin D status, is a serious risk factor for COVID-19, right? Being very severely deficient is really, really bad. So, why doesn't the FDA require a literally like $20 test for all subjects of trials involving COVID-19, so that at the very least you can make sure after the fact that the overall risk of the treatment and control groups were balanced? You wouldn't do a COVID-19 trial without knowing the age and having balanced the groups for age. That should be true of all the major risk factors. So I guess I'm arguing that vitamin D is in this in-between category. You can't use it as a surrogate endpoint, but it's not just a biomarker that's not relevant. That's only relevant for sort of science and research. It's got meaningfulness in terms of like how you analyze efficacy in a trial.
No, again, I don't speak for FDA, but on this, but yeah, I think you made good points, Carl. I think again, and if you can show, if you had a really good aging biomarker, you could make a case for safety analysis, because we do require, like liver enzymes in every trial, and and there's certain things that you have to do, to ensure, trial participant safety. And if there really were, if a drug caused you to age really fast, that wouldn't be a good drug, even if it.
What would be the right way to approach the FDA to suggest that certain categories of trials should be measuring, methylation, methylation clock bioage in these trials, and or for the vitamin D community of researchers to approach the FDA and say the FDA should be measuring vitamin D in all COVID trials, right? What would be the right, what's the approach angle? How do you start that conversation with the FDA?
Again, the companies come in with a trial proposal for like a phase 1 or any IND. You have 30 days to evaluate it. And unless it's like a standard thing, it may not get in there, but it would be, what you suggested isn't a bad idea. A lot of the problems with other vitamin D studies is that when you've done additions, vitamin D is kind of a biomarker of a bad lifestyle in some ways, that you're not out in the sun, maybe you're sitting on the couch all the time or something. My vitamin D level is kind of low. And, but the one good thing that Spanish study showed is that if usually the addition studies haven't shown any benefit. But for COVID, it looks like it did, and so I think that's a good point, Carl. Again, it's just
but you mentioned the companies come, right? Obviously, the companies who come, they're kind of putting the money up. They can measure a bunch of things.
Right. And
how do you approach the FDA to say you need to impose this as a biomarker? Imagine a company came with a COVID drug and said, "Oh, we're going to run a trial, but we're not actually going to measure the age of the subjects in our trial."
Yeah, I think the stratified patient.
Right. Well, how do you get the FDA to sort of impose that?
Yeah, I mean that's not a bad point. I mean, but I'm not the one who would make that decision. I mean, but that's not a bad point. Yeah.
This is one of the reasons why I think if we can find some physiological biomarker that's easily collectible, that can give some useful information like decision-making speed as an early warning symptom for COVID or something like that.
Yeah, I mean,
that has less lift to it because you're not doing blood tests and stuff. If we can show some utility there, that might be a crowbar to sort of open this conversation with the FDA and say, hey, why don't we have every trial? Everyone's got a phone. Every trial should collect walking gait, hands down,
No, I would agree. It's just, hard to get right things in the policy. And like Robert said, for us to write, guidelines or something, that was very difficult, with anything. And yeah, like Rob said.
All right. Thank you. Any new points? Ravi, any revelations for the biomarker project from this?
I thought it was really encouraging. I think the question was sort of thinking about how that fits into, if there is, for example, a window opening up over the next 6 months, is there some avenue there for us to get involved in, like getting biomarkers more accepted by the FDA, the sorts of things Carl's talking about?
If there isn't a change in administration, which member of this regularly meeting group can be appointed to the FDA?
Yeah.
Any volunteers? Okay.
There's always jobs, go to FD.gov.jobs and, you can apply. I mean, man, volunteer. We get a lot of volunteers. Although it's more difficult now with COVID to bring volunteers on to help us with various things.
I have one sort of tangential point just to add, and it'll be quick. A lot of the biomarker thinking changes when you're using a subtractive technology, like therapeutic apheresis or the nanoparticles we're developing, which deplete their targets so they don't deliver drugs. In that case, your marker is your driver. So it creates a very tight integration. And we're not the only ones. There's sweeper antibodies that deplete targets. There's a whole new generation of subtractive technologies that are going to come online. And in those cases, the biomarker is the driver of the disease. So your measurement of these markers will go up as the disease progresses, and your proximal endpoint of efficacy is the depletion of those drivers / markers. So it kind of is going to change the landscape somewhat.
Yeah, I think senescent cells, if you can really prove that they're one of the major causes of a lot of pathologies, I think, but I don't know if everybody believes that, that's what I mean, there's some biological plausibility there for sure, but, if you get rid of all your senescent cells, are you going to, do a lot better in life? I don't know.
Ravi, I saw you unmute. Not sure, or were you already unmuted? Okay, good. Well, this is a boring question, but
that's a Carl. But it just your point seems to be, subtractive technologies have it easy. That's not where the problem is with regard to FDA and surrogate.
No, the difference though with the FDA, we are engaged with them right now, and it to some extent has to do with how you present your diagnostic. If you call it a diagnostic, you're just measuring a molecule, you're also predicting, you have a predictive algorithm on top of what you're measuring. And then the FDA is very alarmed by that, and they want to see that your prediction is correct. If your therapeutic is guided by something that already exists and is simply a measurement of or quantification of a target, then they back off and they say, you can use that, and actually you can use that not just for guiding the dosing, the treatment, but also the funnel that identifies the patient. So it really is a de facto diagnostic. You just can't call it that, or the FDA is going to clamp down and want it to go through its own approval process. That's what we're learning.
Any comments? All right. So I asked a question on the chat, which I'm going to ask again now here. So this discussion that we're having now post Robert leaving, would anyone prefer this not to be published as part of the recording? Then feel free to either say so now or drop me a private message. So far, I think people were in favor of keeping it privately and publicly in messages to me. But if anyone doesn't prefer this to be published at all, then just drop me a message. Very simple, and then it won't see the light of day. All right, well, we are now at 12:27. Lou is waving off. It was really, really good to speak with all of you. I'm hoping that I'll see many of you next Wednesday for Morgen. I'm super excited, and we're going to have more biomarker then. So, and I think for the next few sessions, really. So yeah, thank you so much for joining. This was a lot of fun today, and I can't wait to see you all next week.